Berlin, August 1961. The world woke up to find barbed wire cutting through its heart. Families who had gone to sleep in one city suddenly found themselves divided. Brothers separated from sisters, parents from children. Soldiers stood watch as the wall rose higher, brick by brick, becoming a symbol of fear and control. But this wall was more than concrete. It was the line between two worlds: capitalism and communism, freedom and dictatorship, America and the Soviet Union. This was the Cold War, a conflict that spanned half a century, shaped the lives of billions, and brought humanity to the very edge of nuclear annihilation. It wasn't fought with open battles, but with spies, propaganda, proxy wars, and weapons so powerful they could end civilization in an instant. And to understand how the Cold War changed the world, we must go back to the ashes of World War II. In 1945, the world emerged from the most destructive conflict in human history. World War II had left tens of millions dead, entire cities reduced to rubble, and empires broken. For ordinary people, the end of the war brought relief but also uncertainty. The future of global politics, economics, and security now depended on two rising giants: the United States and the Soviet Union. Unlike Europe, devastated by 6 years of fighting, the United States had come out of the war stronger. Its industries were booming, its homeland untouched by bombs, and its military unmatched. America had also demonstrated a terrifying new power by dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, instantly making it the world's first nuclear superpower. With its economy, military, and political influence, the US was ready to step into a leadership role it had never taken before. This uneasy balance of power set the stage for a new kind of global conflict. The United States and the Soviet Union had once been allies against Hitler, but their visions for the post-war world were very different. America promoted democracy, free markets, and capitalism, hoping to rebuild Europe through cooperation and trade. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, believed in communism, centralized control, and a system that rejected capitalist competition. These ideologies were not just different, they were fundamentally opposed. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, had paid the heaviest price of all. Nearly 27 million of its people had died in the fight against Nazi Germany, and much of its western territory lay in ruins. But the Red Army emerged from the war stronger than ever, having marched into Berlin itself. The Soviets now controlled much of Eastern Europe, including Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and East Germany. Stalin saw these territories as a necessary buffer zone to prevent any future invasion of Russia. But to the west, it looked like expansion and domination. At the same time, the old European powers were fading. Britain and France, exhausted and bankrupt from the war, could no longer maintain their global empires. Colonies in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East began demanding independence, and both the US and the USSR looked to influence these new nations. The stage was set for a battle not only for Europe but for the hearts and minds of the developing world. In the immediate aftermath of the war, however, both superpowers still cooperated publicly. The creation of the United Nations in 1945 symbolized a hope for lasting peace, with both the US and the USSR as founding members. But behind the scenes, suspicion was already brewing. The Soviets feared American attempts to encircle and weaken them, while the Americans worried that Stalin was determined to spread communism far beyond Eastern Europe. By the end of 1945, the seeds of the Cold War had already been planted. The world was no longer defined by a coalition of nations against fascism, but by two superpowers facing each other across a broken continent. Nuclear weapons, ideological differences, and competing visions for the future created a fragile peace, one that could collapse into war at any moment. For millions, the war was over, but a new, colder conflict was just beginning. The end of World War II did not bring the peace many had hoped for. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new division in the world, one that Winston Churchill famously described as the Iron Curtain. The phrase, first used in a 1946 speech at Fulton, Missouri, captured the reality of a world split not only by geography but by ideology. On one side stood the capitalist democracies of the West, led by the United States. On the other stood the communist states of Eastern Europe, dominated by the Soviet Union. The Iron Curtain was more than a metaphor. It symbolized the growing rift between two visions of the future. To the Soviets, communism promised equality, the end of exploitation, and state-controlled economies. To the West, democracy and capitalism represented freedom of speech, individual rights, and open markets. Both sides saw themselves as defenders of the true path to progress, and both regarded the other as a threat to civilization itself. After the war, Joseph Stalin moved quickly to expand Soviet influence. Eastern European nations that had been liberated from Nazi control by the Red Army found themselves under Moscow's shadow. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria all became satellites of the Soviet Union. Though some initially hoped for free elections, it soon became clear that Stalin would tolerate no governments that might lean toward the West. Communist parties, often backed by Soviet military presence, seized power and suppressed opposition. By the late 1940s, Eastern Europe was firmly locked behind the Iron Curtain. For the United States and its allies, this was deeply alarming. During the war, the Soviet Union had been an essential ally against Hitler. But now, Washington saw Stalin's expansion as proof of communist aggression. In response, the West sought ways to contain the spread of communism. The Truman Doctrine of 1947 marked the first major step. President Harry Truman declared that the United States would provide aid to any nation resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. Though not naming the Soviet Union directly, everyone understood the message. America would resist communism wherever it spread. This doctrine was soon put into practice. In Greece, a civil war raged between communist insurgents and the government. U.S. financial and military aid helped the government prevail. In Turkey, pressure from Moscow for control of the Bosporus Strait was resisted with American support. These early actions solidified the idea of containment, a long-term strategy of resisting Soviet influence without directly engaging in war. Meanwhile, Europe itself was struggling with economic devastation. War had left cities in ruins, industries destroyed, and millions homeless. In this climate, communism appeared attractive to many, promising stability and jobs. To counter this, the United States launched the Marshall Plan in 1948. Billions of dollars in economic aid were poured into Western Europe to rebuild infrastructure, revive industries, and stabilize democracies. The Marshall Plan was not only humanitarian but also strategic. It tied Western Europe's future firmly to the capitalist system and created a prosperous barrier against communist expansion. Stalin, unsurprisingly, rejected Marshall Plan aid for Eastern Europe. Instead, he tightened control through the establishment of Comecon, an economic alliance of communist states. While Western Europe began to recover, Eastern Europe stagnated under rigid state planning, widening the gulf between the two halves of the continent. The division of Germany became the most visible symbol of the Iron Curtain. Berlin, once the capital of Hitler's Reich, was now split into 4 zones of occupation, controlled by the US, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Tensions grew as the Western powers sought to merge their zones into a democratic West Germany, while Stalin aimed to keep the entire country within the Soviet sphere. In 1948, he launched the Berlin blockade, cutting off all road and rail access to the city's western sectors. In response, the Allies organized the Berlin Airlift, flying in food and supplies for nearly a year until Stalin lifted the blockade. The episode not only prevented West Berlin from falling but also showed the world that neither side would back down easily. The Cold War has ended, but its shadow lingers. Every missile in a silo, every troop deployed to a border, every speech about rivalry reminds us of the past we narrowly survived. But history does not have to repeat itself. The Cold War is a warning written in the ashes of the 20th century that unchecked competition, fear, and pride can bring humanity to the edge of destruction. The question now is simple. Will we learn from that warning, or will we ignore it? The Cold War may have ended in 1991, but the struggle for peace, security, and survival continues, today, and for generations to come. By the end of the 1940s, Europe was divided into 2 opposing camps. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was formed in 1949 as a military alliance of Western powers against potential Soviet aggression. In turn, the Soviets would later establish the Warsaw Pact in 1955 to cement their control over Eastern Europe. The Iron Curtain had become a permanent fixture of the Cold War landscape. The fall of the Iron Curtain was not about a single wall or border. It was about a continent split in 2. Families were divided, trade routes severed, and cultures isolated from one another. What had once been an allied front against fascism had now transformed into 2 hostile blocs staring each other down across barbed wire and watchtowers. Churchill's warning proved prophetic. The Iron Curtain was not just a line on a map. It was a symbol of distrust, fear, and the clash of ideologies that would define the second half of the 20th century. The Cold War had truly begun. The German capital of Berlin became the first great flashpoint of the Cold War. It was here, in the smoldering ruins of Hitler's former stronghold, that the fragile alliance between East and West collapsed into open confrontation. At stake was not just the fate of a city but the future of Europe itself. After World War II, Germany had been divided into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. Berlin, though located deep inside the Soviet zone, was also split among the four powers. For a time, this uneasy arrangement held, but cracks soon appeared. The Western Allies wanted to rebuild Germany's economy, integrating their zones into a stronger, more stable nation. The Soviets, by contrast, sought to keep Germany weak, ensuring it would never again rise as a military threat. Tensions sharpened in 1948 when the United States, Britain, and France announced plans to merge their zones into a single West German state and introduced a new currency, the Deutsche Mark. The move promised economic recovery but infuriated Stalin. He saw it as a direct challenge to Soviet authority and feared it would pull Germany permanently into the Western camp. His response was bold and ruthless: cut Berlin off from the outside world. In June 1948, Soviet forces sealed all road, rail, and canal routes into West Berlin. Electricity was cut, and supplies of coal, food, and medicine were blocked. More than 2 million residents of West Berlin faced the prospect of starvation and freezing in the coming winter. The Soviet gamble was clear: either the Western Allies abandoned Berlin, or the city would fall under communist control. For the United States and its allies, the crisis posed a daunting question: would they stand firm, or retreat before Soviet pressure? Direct military confrontation risked plunging Europe into a Third World War only 3 years after the last one had ended. Yet abandoning Berlin would shatter Western credibility and signal weakness in the face of Soviet aggression. The answer came in the skies. American and British leaders devised a daring plan to supply the entire city by air. Thus began one of the greatest humanitarian and logistical operations in history, the Berlin Airlift. Day after day, Allied aircraft roared into West Berlin, landing at Tempelhof, Gatow, and later Tegel airports. Cargo planes carried everything from sacks of flour and potatoes to fuel and even Christmas candy for children. At its peak, planes were landing in Berlin every few minutes, a continuous lifeline that defied Soviet hopes of surrender. Pilots faced dangerous conditions: fog, ice, narrow runways, and the constant risk of Soviet harassment. But their determination never wavered. For the people of Berlin, the airlift became a symbol of hope. Residents watched as Rosenbomber, or raisin bombers, parachuted small packages of sweets for children, a gesture that captured hearts around the world. Despite rationing and hardship, West Berliners endured, their resilience proving as critical as the supplies themselves. The operation soon outpaced Soviet expectations. By early 1949, the airlift was delivering more goods than had previously arrived by land. The blockade, intended to break Berlin's spirit, instead became a humiliation for Stalin. After nearly a year of failure, the Soviets lifted the blockade in May 1949. The consequences were profound. The airlift had demonstrated Western resolve and the power of cooperation under American leadership. It marked the first major victory of the Cold War for the United States and Britain. At the same time, it hardened the division of Germany. That autumn, 2 states were officially born: the Federal Republic of Germany in the west, and the German Democratic Republic in the east. The Iron Curtain was no longer just a metaphor. It was a political reality, running straight through the heart of Europe. Berlin remained a tense outpost, a city divided by ideology, surrounded by communist territory yet tied to the west. For decades to come, it would serve as the front line of the Cold War, a constant reminder of both the dangers of conflict and the possibility of resistance. The Berlin blockade and airlift was more than a struggle over supplies. It was a battle of wills. In the skies above a shattered city, the West proved it would not retreat before Soviet pressure, and in doing so, it set the tone for the long confrontation that lay ahead. The end of World War II introduced a terrifying new reality: nuclear weapons. When the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, it demonstrated a weapon so powerful it could wipe out entire cities in seconds. At first, America had a monopoly on this technology, but the Soviet Union, determined not to remain vulnerable, accelerated its own nuclear program. By 1949, just 4 years later, the Soviets successfully tested their first atomic bomb, shocking the world. The nuclear arms race had officially begun. For the next 4 decades, both superpowers would pour vast resources into building bigger, deadlier, and more sophisticated weapons. The stakes were not just military, they were existential. The entire future of humanity seemed to hang in the balance. By the early 1950s, the arms race escalated dramatically. The United States developed the hydrogen bomb in 1952, a weapon thousands of times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Japan. Only a year later, the Soviet Union responded with its own hydrogen bomb test. This rapid leap in destructive capability meant that nuclear war would no longer destroy just one or two cities. It could potentially end civilization itself. As both sides stockpiled weapons, a strange and frightening doctrine emerged: mutually assured destruction, MAD. The logic was simple but terrifying. If either the United States or the Soviet Union launched a nuclear attack, the other side would retaliate with equal or greater force. The result would be the complete destruction of both nations and likely the world. In this twisted balance of terror, survival depended not on disarmament but on overwhelming arsenals. Both superpowers raced to build thousands of warheads, along with new ways to deliver them. Intercontinental ballistic missiles (ICBMs) could strike targets across the globe in under 30 minutes. Submarine-launched ballistic missiles (SLBMs) gave both sides the ability to strike from hidden, underwater vessels. Nuclear bombers constantly patrolled the skies, ready to retaliate at a moment's notice. The Cold War became a chess match with apocalyptic consequences. But this balance also had an unexpected effect. Paradoxically, nuclear weapons may have prevented direct war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Leaders on both sides understood that a full-scale conflict would mean mutual annihilation. Instead, competition played out indirectly through proxy wars, espionage, and technological rivalry. Yet the threat of nuclear war hung over everyday life. In the United States, schoolchildren practiced duck and cover drills, hiding under desks as if it would protect them from a nuclear blast. Families built fallout shelters in their backyards, stocking them with canned food and supplies. Popular culture reflected the anxiety. Films, books, and TV shows imagined worlds destroyed by atomic fire. On both sides of the Iron Curtain, ordinary citizens lived under the shadow of nuclear annihilation. Political leaders, too, wrestled with the terrifying responsibility of command. A single decision, made in minutes, could unleash destruction on a scale the world had never seen. To prevent accidental war, systems of communication and control were established. Nuclear football, carried by American military aides, followed the president everywhere, containing launch codes and strike plans. The Soviets developed similar protocols, ensuring their leaders always had access to the means of retaliation. As the 1960s approached, the arms race intensified further. Each new advancement by one superpower was matched by the other, ensuring the balance of terror remained intact. The sheer size of the stockpiles became almost unimaginable. By the height of the Cold War, the United States and Soviet Union together possessed tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, enough to destroy the planet many times over. The nuclear arms race was not just about weapons, it was about ideology, power, and fear. For the United States, nuclear superiority was a guarantee of freedom and democracy's survival. For the Soviet Union, it was proof of strength and security against capitalist encirclement. Neither side could afford to show weakness, for fear of emboldening the other. By the end of this era, humanity found itself in a precarious paradox. The very weapons that could destroy civilization also prevented its destruction. Mutually assured destruction created a tense peace, but it was peace perched on the edge of catastrophe. The nuclear arms race had not only reshaped military strategy, it had reshaped the psychology of the entire world. The Korean Peninsula, 1950. A rugged land scarred by decades of Japanese occupation, divided by a line drawn hastily at the end of World War II, the 38th parallel. To the north, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, led by the fiery and ambitious Kim Il-sung, backed by the Soviet Union. To the south, the Republic of Korea, under Syngman Rhee, propped up by the United States. The division was never meant to be permanent, but in the early dawn hours of June 25, 1950, it became something far darker. North Korean tanks, supplied by the Soviets, thundered across the 38th parallel. Waves of troops poured southward, overwhelming the poorly equipped South Korean forces. Within days, the capital city of Seoul had fallen. The world watched in shock. The Cold War, until now a battle of words, ideology, and intimidation, had just turned hot. In Washington, President Harry Truman faced a terrible choice: allow communism to spread unchecked, or risk a war that could ignite the globe. To Truman, the lesson of appeasement in the 1930s still lingered. He would not let another aggressor go unchallenged. Within days, the United States and its allies moved. Under the banner of the newly formed United Nations, an international coalition was assembled. Soldiers from Britain, Canada, Australia, Turkey, and more would join American forces to defend the South. But it was the U.S. that carried the heaviest burden. General Douglas MacArthur, the legendary commander of the Pacific in World War II, was given the task of turning the tide. By late summer, things looked desperate. South Korean and UN forces were pushed back into a tiny pocket around the port city of Pusan. Supplies were low, morale was lower. Many believed the war was already lost, but MacArthur had other plans. In September 1950, MacArthur launched one of the most audacious military maneuvers of the century, the Incheon landing. Amphibious forces stormed ashore far behind enemy lines, cutting off North Korean supply routes. The gamble paid off spectacularly. Within weeks, the UN forces had not only broken out of Pusan but retaken Seoul. The North Koreans, once unstoppable, were now in retreat. But MacArthur didn't stop there. He pushed northward past the 38th parallel, determined to reunify the Korean peninsula under the South. The UN advanced all the way to the Yalu River, the very border with China, and that's when the Cold War took a dangerous new turn. In Beijing, Mao Zedong watched the advance with alarm. To Mao, the sight of American-led forces at China's doorstep was unacceptable. Despite being exhausted from years of civil war, Mao made a fateful decision: China would intervene. In late October 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops, known as the People's Volunteer Army, slipped across the border under the cover of night. Armed with little more than rifles, grenades, and raw determination, they struck with ferocious surprise. The UN forces were caught off guard. Entire divisions were thrown into retreat. In the bitter winter cold, battles like the Chosin Reservoir became legendary for their brutality. Surrounded and outnumbered, US Marines fought their way out against overwhelming odds, leaving behind frozen battlefields littered with casualties. By early 1951, the war had turned again. Seoul fell for the second time. The once unstoppable advance of the UN had been shattered by sheer numbers and determination. For the next 2 years, the war settled into a grinding stalemate near the original dividing line, the 38th parallel. Trench warfare reminiscent of World War I scarred the Korean hills. Villages were obliterated by artillery and bombs. For soldiers, it was a war of mud, blood, and endless waiting. For civilians, it was a nightmare. Millions of Koreans fled their homes, many never to return. Families were torn apart, separated by a line on a map that hardened into a permanent border. The world outside Korea was horrified. Here was proof that the Cold War wasn't just speeches and threats. It could erupt into real war, claiming millions of lives. As the stalemate dragged on, tensions rose far beyond Korea. General MacArthur, frustrated with political limits, even suggested using nuclear weapons against China, a proposal that horrified President Truman. Truman relieved MacArthur of his command, a shocking move against a national hero. The message was clear: this war could not expand further. A third world war, especially a nuclear one, had to be avoided at all costs. Finally, after 2 more years of grinding battles and failed negotiations, an armistice was signed in July 1953. There was no victory parade, no peace treaty, just a ceasefire that left the Korean peninsula divided exactly where it had started, along the 38th parallel. The Korean War cost the lives of more than 3 million people, most of them civilians. It devastated a nation, solidified the division between North and South Korea, and set the stage for decades of hostility that continue to this very day. For the world, it was a chilling revelation. The Cold War was no longer a game of ideology and politics. It was a deadly reality. From then on, every confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union carried the possibility of exploding into another Korea, or something far worse. And the next time, the world would come closer to nuclear war than ever before. October 1962. The world stood on the brink of annihilation. For 13 days, humanity teetered closer to nuclear war than at any other point in history. It began with photographs. High above the Caribbean, an American U-2 reconnaissance plane swept across the skies of Cuba. As the cameras clicked, they captured something terrifying: long, rectangular missile sites under construction. Soviet nuclear missiles, capable of striking Washington, New York, or nearly any city in the United States within minutes, were being secretly installed just 90 miles from American shores. When President John F. Kennedy received the intelligence, he knew instantly this was the gravest threat of the Cold War. The missiles weren't just weapons, they were symbols of power. The United States already had nuclear missiles positioned in Turkey, aimed at Moscow. To Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, placing missiles in Cuba was both a way to protect Fidel Castro's communist regime and to level the strategic playing field. But for the Americans, it was intolerable. Nuclear weapons in Cuba meant that no warning, no defense, no second chances would be possible if the Soviets ever launched. The US could not allow it. Kennedy convened his closest advisors, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, known as EXCOM. The room was tense. Options flew across the table. Some demanded immediate airstrikes to bomb the sites, followed by a full invasion of Cuba. Others feared this would guarantee war with the Soviet Union. Kennedy listened, calm but firm. He knew one mistake could unleash nuclear Armageddon. Finally, he chose a middle path, a naval blockade, which he called a quarantine. American warships would surround Cuba, preventing Soviet ships from delivering more missiles or equipment. On October 22, Kennedy addressed the nation in a televised speech. His words were measured, but behind them was steel. "We will not prematurely or unnecessarily risk the costs of worldwide nuclear war in which even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth. But neither will we shrink from that risk at any time it must be faced." The world now knew the truth, and the countdown to disaster had begun. Soviet ships carrying more missiles and supplies steamed toward the blockade line. American warships and aircraft carriers waited. A single wrong move, a nervous trigger finger, a misunderstood order, could unleash a war that would end civilization. In Washington, the Pentagon prepared for invasion plans. In Moscow, Khrushchev sent letters, some conciliatory, others defiant. The world watched, breathless. Ordinary Americans emptied grocery stores and built fallout shelters in panic. In Cuba, anti-aircraft guns were placed on high alert. The atmosphere was electric with fear. On October 27, known as Black Saturday, the crisis nearly boiled over. An American U-2 plane was shot down over Cuba, killing its pilot. Another U-2 accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace over Siberia, almost sparking retaliation. At the same time, a Soviet submarine near the blockade, harassed by American depth charges, prepared to launch a nuclear torpedo. Only the refusal of one man, Soviet officer Vasily Arkhipov, prevented a strike that could have ignited global war. The world was seconds from catastrophe. Behind the scenes, Kennedy and Khrushchev exchanged desperate messages. Khrushchev's first letter, emotional and rambling, offered a way out, remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for an American pledge not to invade the island. His second letter, harder and more aggressive, demanded the U.S. also remove its nuclear missiles from Turkey. Kennedy faced a gamble. He chose to publicly accept the first letter, while quietly agreeing to the second demand in secret. It was a delicate dance of diplomacy, showing strength in public while offering compromise in private. On October 28, Khrushchev finally blinked. He announced the Soviet Union would dismantle the missile sites in Cuba and return the weapons home. In return, the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba. Secretly, American missiles in Turkey would also be withdrawn months later. The world exhaled. Nuclear war had been averted, barely. The Cuban Missile Crisis was more than a showdown of ships and missiles. It was a test of nerves, leadership, and the terrifying reality of nuclear brinkmanship. Kennedy emerged as a hero, praised for his steady hand and restraint. Khrushchev, though humiliated, had at least secured a promise that Cuba would remain safe from American invasion. But the greatest lesson was for humanity itself. The world had looked into the abyss and turned back. In the aftermath, a direct hotline was established between Washington and Moscow, so leaders could speak instantly in times of crisis. Arms control talks began, as both sides realized how close they had come to mutual destruction. Still, the shadow of those 13 days lingered. The Cold War continued, fiercer than ever. The US and USSR would keep building weapons, fighting proxy wars, and challenging one another across the globe. But everyone knew the line between survival and annihilation was razor thin, and the next great battlefield of the Cold War would not be on an island in the Caribbean, but in the jungles of Southeast Asia, Vietnam. The jungles of Southeast Asia. Thick, humid air, the buzz of insects, the rustle of unseen movement in the tall grass. For American soldiers, Vietnam was a world away from home, an alien battlefield where every shadow could hide the enemy. The Vietnam War wasn't just another regional conflict. It became the defining struggle of the Cold War, a proxy war where two superpowers fought for influence not with direct confrontation, but through blood spilled by others. Vietnam had been under French colonial rule for decades, but after World War II, anti-colonial movements swept the globe. In Vietnam, a nationalist and communist leader named Ho Chi Minh declared independence. When the French tried to reassert control, they were met with fierce resistance. The climactic Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954 ended in French defeat, forcing them to withdraw. But victory didn't bring unity. Instead, Vietnam was divided. The North, led by Ho Chi Minh, backed by the Soviet Union and China. The South, led by Ngo Dinh Diem, supported by the United States. The line between them, the 17th parallel, was meant to be temporary. Elections were supposed to reunify the country, but those elections never came. For Washington, Vietnam was not about borders, it was about the domino theory. The fear that if one country in Asia fell to communism, others would follow. Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, maybe even farther, so the US pledged to hold the line. At first, America's involvement was limited: advisors, weapons, money. But by the early 1960s, small deployments turned into full-scale commitment. By 1965, U.S. combat troops were landing by the tens of thousands. Eventually, more than 500,000 Americans would serve in Vietnam. But this wasn't a conventional war. The enemy wasn't lined up in open battlefields. Instead, the Viet Cong, communist guerrillas supported by the North, melted into villages, jungles, and tunnels. American firepower was overwhelming: B-52 bombers, helicopters, napalm. But technology couldn't root out an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere at once. Every hill gain seemed to be lost again. Every victory was temporary. America was trapped in a war it couldn't win, yet couldn't abandon. Behind the scenes, the Soviet Union and China poured weapons, training, and supplies into North Vietnam. Soviet-made AK-47s, artillery, and surface-to-air missiles shot American planes from the skies. Though Moscow and Washington never fired directly at each other, Vietnam became a deadly stage for their rivalry. Each side sought to prove the superiority of its system, capitalism versus communism, through the bodies of Vietnamese civilians and soldiers. But as the war dragged on, another battle erupted, this time within the United States itself. Television brought the brutality of war into American living rooms. Images of burning villages, wounded soldiers, and body bags shook the public. By the late 1960s, protests erupted across universities and cities. Young Americans chanted, "Hell no, we won't go!" Draft cards were burned. Demonstrators clashed with police. The war divided generations, split families, and eroded trust in government. When U.S. troops shot and killed student protesters at Kent State University in 1970, outrage exploded. To many, Vietnam was no longer about fighting communism. It was about questioning the very soul of America. Despite enormous sacrifices, victory remained elusive. The North Vietnamese, fueled by ideology and nationalism, refused to surrender. By the early 1970s, U.S. leaders sought a way out. President Richard Nixon introduced Vietnamization, training South Vietnamese forces to fight while gradually withdrawing American troops. Peace talks dragged on, but the fighting continued. Finally, in 1973, the U.S. signed the Paris Peace Accords and pulled its last combat troops out of Vietnam. But peace was an illusion. Just 2 years later, in 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon. The South collapsed. Helicopters frantically evacuated the last Americans from rooftops as desperate civilians clung to the skids, begging to escape. Vietnam had fallen. For the United States, Vietnam was more than a military defeat. It was a psychological wound, a reminder that even the most powerful nation on earth could be humbled. For the Soviet Union, it was a triumph of influence, proving that determination and guerrilla warfare could outlast America's might. And for the Cold War itself, Vietnam showed that the conflict between superpowers would not be decided in Washington or Moscow, but in jungles, deserts, and mountains across the world, through proxy wars where ordinary people paid the price. But even as America licked its wounds, another kind of battle was being fought, not with bombs or rifles, but with rockets aimed at the stars. The space race was about to redefine the Cold War in the most dramatic way yet. The Cold War wasn't only fought on the ground, in proxy wars, or intense diplomatic standoffs. It was also fought in the skies, and eventually, in the vast emptiness of space. In 1957, the Soviet Union shocked the world when they launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. It was a small, beeping metal sphere, but its significance was enormous. For the first time in history, humanity had placed something beyond Earth's atmosphere, and it was the Soviets who had done it before anyone else. Only a month later, the Soviets escalated the competition by sending Laika, a stray dog, aboard Sputnik 2. While Laika did not survive, the mission showed the world that the USSR was capable of life-supporting spaceflight. Americans grew anxious, fearing that their nation was falling behind. President Dwight D. Eisenhower responded by creating NASA in 1958, officially committing the United States to the race. The 1960s became a decade of spectacular competition. The Soviets continued to push the boundaries. In 1961, they stunned the world yet again by sending Yuri Gagarin into orbit aboard Vostok 1, making him the first human in space. His flight lasted just 108 minutes, but it made him an international hero and cemented Soviet dominance in the early years of the space race. For the United States, this was a wake-up call. America needed to catch up, and quickly. Newly elected President John F. Kennedy delivered one of the most famous speeches in American history in 1961, declaring that the United States would put a man on the moon before the decade ended. It was an ambitious goal, almost unimaginable at the time, but it electrified the American public and set NASA on a mission unlike any other. The US began a series of spaceflight programs: Mercury, Gemini, and finally Apollo, each step preparing astronauts for longer, more complex missions. The Gemini program trained astronauts in maneuvering spacecraft and performing spacewalks, crucial skills for future lunar missions. Meanwhile, the Soviets continued their own achievements, such as sending the first woman, Valentina Tereshkova, into space in 1963. The world watched in awe as the competition escalated. For both superpowers, space was a stage to demonstrate not just technological progress, but ideological superiority. To land on the moon meant proving to the entire planet that your system, democracy or communism, was the future. Finally, in July 1969, after years of failures, accidents, and billions of dollars invested, the United States achieved its goal. Apollo 11 blasted off from Florida, carrying Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. On July 20th, Armstrong descended the ladder of the lunar module Eagle and set foot on the moon. His words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," were broadcast to millions of people across the globe. The US had won the ultimate prize in the space race. The moon landing was more than a victory for America. It was a symbolic triumph of Western science, innovation, and determination. It did not end the Cold War, but it proved that competition could drive humanity to accomplish the impossible. Technology, once a tool of destruction, had also become a pathway to exploration and inspiration. The space race showed the world that the Cold War wasn't only about fear and division. It also pushed the boundaries of human achievement, leaving behind legacies of satellites, rockets, and a vision of space exploration that continues to this day. The 1970s brought a strange shift in the Cold War. For decades, the United States and the Soviet Union had been locked in an unforgiving rivalry, staring at each other through the barrel of nuclear weapons. But suddenly, the word détente, a French term meaning relaxation, entered the global stage. Both sides were exhausted. The US was deeply scarred by the Vietnam War, its people weary of conflict, and its economy under strain. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was struggling to keep pace militarily and economically, bearing the heavy weight of its massive defense spending. The idea of easing tensions began to look attractive. One of the defining moments of this period was President Richard Nixon's historic 1972 visit to China. At the time, China had broken away from the Soviet Union in a bitter split, leaving Moscow isolated in parts of the communist world. Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, saw an opportunity. If Washington could improve relations with Beijing, it would pressure Moscow into negotiating as well. Nixon's meeting with Chairman Mao Zedong shocked the world. The image of an American president shaking hands with the leader of Communist China was unthinkable just a decade earlier. It marked a brilliant move in Cold War chess. The US effectively drove a wedge between the two largest communist powers. Not long after, Nixon turned to the Soviet Union. That same year, he traveled to Moscow to meet Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet leader. The result was the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT-I, which placed limits on nuclear missile systems. For the first time in the Cold War, Washington and Moscow agreed to slow the arms race instead of escalating it. To ordinary people, détente brought a sigh of relief. The nightmare of nuclear annihilation seemed to fade slightly. The 1970s saw other signs of cooperation. Trade increased between the two blocs. Cultural exchanges became more common, and global diplomacy seemed less suffocating. But détente was never about friendship. It was a strategic pause. The Soviet Union still spread its influence in Africa and Asia, while the US kept strengthening alliances and military bases around the world. Both sides were waiting, watching, and preparing for the next move. The 1970s saw other signs of cooperation. Trade increased between the two blocs. Cultural exchanges became more common, and global diplomacy seemed less suffocating. But détente was never about friendship. It was a strategic pause. The Soviet Union still spread its influence in Africa and Asia, while the US kept strengthening alliances and military bases around the world. Both sides were waiting, watching, and preparing for the next move. Then came the 1980s, and with them, a new face of American leadership, Ronald Reagan. To Reagan, the Soviet Union was not just a rival. It was, as he famously called it, the evil empire. His fiery speeches reignited Cold War rhetoric. Reagan believed the way to end the struggle wasn't through compromise, but through overwhelming strength. He launched a massive military buildup, pouring billions into new weapons systems. The most ambitious of these was the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, nicknamed Star Wars, a plan to develop space-based missile defense systems. To many, it sounded like science fiction, but it terrified the Soviet leadership, who feared they could not compete with American technological advancements. The renewed tensions of the Reagan era created one of the most dangerous moments of the entire Cold War. In 1983, during a NATO military exercise called Able Archer, Soviet leaders mistakenly believed a U.S. nuclear strike might be imminent. The world teetered on the edge of accidental war. At the same time, inside the Soviet Union, cracks were deepening. The massive costs of competing with Reagan's buildup, combined with their own stagnating economy, left the USSR struggling to keep pace. Thus, the détente of the 1970s gave way to the fiery showdown of the 1980s. Yet ironically, it was this pressure, combined with new Soviet leadership, that would eventually bring the Cold War to its final act. In December 1979, the Soviet Union launched a full-scale invasion of Afghanistan. On paper, Moscow's intervention looked like an easy opportunity: prop up a friendly communist government, secure influence in Central Asia, and demonstrate Soviet strength. But what the Kremlin thought would be a quick campaign turned into a bloody, decade-long quagmire, often described as the Soviet Union's own Vietnam. The story began earlier, in 1978, when a communist coup overthrew Afghanistan's government. The new regime, known as the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan (PDPA), was deeply unpopular. Its radical reforms, such as land redistribution, restrictions on tribal power, and moves against Islamic traditions, sparked rebellion across the country. Civil war erupted, and by late 1979, the Afghan state was on the verge of collapse. Fearing the loss of control in a region bordering their own southern republics, the Soviets decided to intervene. On December 24, 1979, Soviet troops poured across the border, and special forces stormed the presidential palace in Kabul, assassinating Afghan leader Hafizullah Amin. A new Soviet-backed government under Babur Karmal was installed, supposedly to bring stability. Instead, it fueled even more anger. For the Afghan people, the Soviet presence was seen as a foreign occupation. What followed was a brutal guerrilla war. Local fighters, known as the Mujahideen, took up arms against the Red Army. They had the advantage of terrain. Afghanistan's steep mountains, valleys, and villages made it almost impossible for conventional Soviet forces to dominate. Soviet troops found themselves ambushed, bombed, and sniped at in endless hit-and-run attacks. The United States quickly saw an opportunity. Still stinging from Vietnam, Washington realized it could now give the Soviets their own nightmare. Through the CIA's covert program known as Operation Cyclone, billions of dollars in weapons, supplies, and training were funneled to the Mujahideen. The money often passed through Pakistan's intelligence service, the ISI, which became a key middleman. The most famous weapon supplied was the Stinger missile, a shoulder-fired anti-air system that allowed Afghan fighters to shoot down Soviet helicopters, which had been crucial for transporting troops and supplies. Other countries joined in. Saudi Arabia sent money, China and Egypt sent arms, and thousands of foreign fighters poured into Afghanistan to join the jihad. Among them was a young Saudi named Osama bin Laden, who would later form Al-Qaeda. The war dragged on year after year. For Soviet soldiers, Afghanistan became a nightmare. They faced an enemy they could rarely see, fighting in an environment that sapped morale. Villages were bombed, civilians were displaced, and atrocities were committed on both sides. At home in the USSR, the war grew increasingly unpopular. Mothers of dead soldiers began demanding answers. Soviet resources were bleeding out. Money, equipment, and manpower poured into a conflict with no victory in sight. Meanwhile, on the world stage, the invasion shocked the West. It effectively ended the spirit of détente. U.S. President Jimmy Carter called it the most serious threat to peace since World War II. The United States boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics in protest, and relations between East and West froze once more. By the mid-1980s, the conflict was crippling the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev, who became leader in 1985, called Afghanistan a bleeding wound. He recognized that the war was unwinnable and too costly for a struggling Soviet economy. Finally, in 1989, after nearly 10 years of fighting and more than 15,000 Soviet soldiers dead, the Red Army withdrew. The war left Afghanistan shattered, its cities in ruins and millions of its people displaced as refugees. For the Soviets, it was a humiliation, proof that their military might have limits. Some historians argue that the Afghan War was one of the key factors that accelerated the collapse of the Soviet Union just a few years later. The invasion of Afghanistan was not just a Cold War battle, it was a turning point. It showed that even superpowers could bleed, and it set the stage for new global challenges that would outlast the Cold War itself. By the late 1980s, the Cold War was beginning to show cracks. For decades, the Soviet Union had maintained a tight grip on Eastern Europe, controlling its satellite states through military power, political manipulation, and fear. But under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, change was in the air. Gorbachev introduced two revolutionary policies: glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. Glasnost encouraged freedom of speech, greater transparency in government, and open discussion of social problems. Perestroika sought to reform the stagnant Soviet economy by introducing limited market mechanisms. These policies were intended to save the Soviet system, but in reality, they unleashed forces that would spiral far beyond Gorbachev's control. Eastern Europe had been living under the shadow of Soviet domination since the end of World War II. In countries like East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, dissent had always existed but had been brutally suppressed whenever it threatened Soviet authority. Yet by the 1980s, ordinary people were becoming bolder. Economic stagnation, lack of freedoms, and the obvious prosperity of the West across the Iron Curtain fueled resentment. The spread of Gorbachev's reforms signaled that Moscow was no longer willing, or perhaps no longer able, to send in tanks to crush uprisings, as it had in Hungary in 1956 or Czechoslovakia in 1968. East Germany became the focal point of this transformation. The Berlin Wall, built in 1961, was the physical and symbolic representation of the Cold War divide. It separated families, split a city in two, and stood as a reminder of the lengths the communist regime would go to prevent its people from fleeing to the West. By the late 1980s, however, pressure was mounting. Thousands of East Germans began fleeing through neighboring countries like Hungary and Czechoslovakia, where communist governments were loosening restrictions. The East German leadership, under the hardline Erich Honecker, tried to resist reform, but the tide of history was against them. Meanwhile, protests grew. In cities like Leipzig, massive demonstrations called for freedom of movement, democratic reforms, and an end to repression. The crowds grew week after week, with hundreds of thousands filling the streets. What made these protests especially powerful was that the government did not respond with its usual force. The East German authorities hesitated, unsure if Moscow would back them. Gorbachev had made it clear the Soviet Union would not use force to prop up failing communist regimes. This was a decisive break from the past. In November 1989, the East German government made a critical mistake. Facing growing unrest, officials hastily announced that citizens would be allowed to travel to the West. Confusion in communication led to chaos. On the night of November 9, 1989, thousands of East Berliners gathered at border checkpoints. Guards, unsure of what to do and unwilling to fire on their own people, eventually opened the gates. The once impregnable Berlin Wall had been breached, not with bombs or armies, but with cheers and hammers. Overjoyed Berliners climbed the wall, smashing it with pickaxes, and embraced family members from the other side. Television cameras broadcast the scenes worldwide, capturing what became one of the most iconic moments of the 20th century. The fall of the Berlin Wall was more than just the collapse of a barrier. It was the collapse of an entire system. Within weeks, communist governments across Eastern Europe fell like dominoes. In Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, democratic movements swept away decades of one-party rule. Even in the Soviet Union itself, the momentum for change was unstoppable. The Iron Curtain, which had divided Europe for almost half a century, was lifted. For the world, this was the moment when the Cold War's end became inevitable. The wall had symbolized division, fear, and the threat of nuclear conflict. Its destruction symbolized hope, unity, and the triumph of people power over authoritarian regimes. President Ronald Reagan's famous 1987 demand, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," suddenly seemed prophetic. The Cold War was not officially over yet, but with the Berlin Wall gone, its end was in sight. The images of Berliners dancing atop the ruins of the wall remain some of the most powerful reminders that even in the darkest times, ordinary people can shape history. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union, once a mighty superpower that had terrified the West with its nuclear arsenal and global influence, was showing cracks that could no longer be hidden. For decades, the Soviet state had projected an image of strength, discipline, and control, but beneath the surface, its economy was stagnating, its people were frustrated, and its ideology was losing credibility. The final years of the USSR would see an avalanche of crises, political upheaval, economic disaster, nationalist revolts, and a failed coup. All of this culminated in the shocking collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, marking the definitive end of the Cold War. At the heart of the Soviet downfall was its economy. The centrally planned system that had once rapidly industrialized the country was now suffocating under inefficiency and corruption. Factories produced goods that nobody wanted, shortages were widespread, and black markets flourished. While the United States and Western Europe were thriving from new technologies, consumer goods, and globalization, the Soviet Union remained trapped in an outdated economic model. Military spending was another major drain. For decades, the USSR had poured enormous resources into its armed forces and nuclear arsenal in order to compete with the West. This arms race left little room for investment in consumer needs. Ordinary Soviet citizens stood in long lines for basic products like bread, meat, or even toilet paper. By the late 1980s, living standards lagged far behind those in the West, and disillusionment spread across the population. When Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary in 1985, he recognized that the Soviet system could not continue as it was. He introduced two groundbreaking reforms: Glasnost, openness, and Perestroika, restructuring. Glasnost allowed more freedom of speech, transparency in government, and public criticism of the Communist Party, things that had been unthinkable for decades. Meanwhile, Perestroika sought to reform the failing economy by introducing limited market elements and reducing central planning. At first, these reforms inspired hope, but they quickly spiraled out of control. Glasnost unleashed a flood of pent-up frustration. Citizens openly criticized corruption, exposed historical crimes like Stalin's purges, and demanded democratic rights. Nationalist groups in places like the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, began calling for independence. Perestroika, meanwhile, failed to rescue the economy. Instead, it led to more shortages, inflation, and unemployment. The reforms weakened the state without delivering improvements, deepening the crisis. One of the most powerful forces tearing the USSR apart was nationalism. The Soviet Union was not a single nation but a vast empire of 15 republics and over 100 ethnic groups. For decades, the Communist Party had suppressed ethnic identity in the name of unity. But once Glasnost opened the door, nationalist movements spread like wildfire. In the Baltics, huge human chains formed in peaceful protests demanding freedom. In Georgia, Armenia, and Ukraine, nationalist groups pushed for greater autonomy or independence. Even within Russia itself, voices began calling for sovereignty apart from Moscow's control. By the late 1980s, it was becoming clear that the Union was no longer united. The breaking point came in August 1991. Hardline members of the Communist Party, alarmed by Gorbachev's reforms and the growing independence movements, launched a coup to restore control. They placed Gorbachev under house arrest while he was on vacation in Crimea and declared a state of emergency. Tanks rolled into Moscow, and the world held its breath. But the coup quickly faltered. Crowds of ordinary Russians poured into the streets to resist, rallying around Boris Yeltsin, the newly elected president of the Russian Republic. In a now iconic moment, Yeltsin climbed on top of a tank outside the Russian parliament and denounced the coup. His defiance inspired resistance, and within days, the coup collapsed. Far from saving the Soviet Union, the attempt only accelerated its demise. The Communist Party was discredited, and Gorbachev's authority was fatally weakened. After the failed coup, the momentum for independence became unstoppable. Republic after republic declared sovereignty or outright independence. Ukraine, the second largest republic, voted overwhelmingly to leave the Union in December 1991. Soon after, leaders from Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met secretly in a forest lodge and signed the Belavisa Accords, declaring that the Soviet Union no longer existed. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union, acknowledging the reality of the collapse. That same evening, the Soviet flag with its hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time and replaced by the Russian tricolor. The empire that had stood for nearly 70 years was gone. 15 independent states emerged from its ruins, with Russia as the largest successor. The dissolution of the Soviet Union marked the official end of the Cold War. For decades, the world had lived under the shadow of two superpowers locked in ideological, military, and political struggle. Suddenly, only one superpower remained: the United States. The global balance of power shifted overnight. The collapse of the USSR was not just a political event, it was a profound moment in world history. It represented the failure of the communist experiment in its most ambitious form. It also unleashed new challenges: economic hardship in the former Soviet republics, ethnic conflicts, and political instability. But above all, it signaled that the Cold War, with all its fear, tension, and rivalry, was finally over. The year was 1991. The Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the final time, replaced by the tricolor of the Russian Federation. For many, It was the end of an era. The Cold War was over. The world breathed a sigh of relief. After decades of tension, proxy wars, nuclear brinkmanship, and ideological battles, the shadow of global annihilation seemed to fade. But history rarely offers clean endings. The Cold War ended, yet its legacy continues to shape our world to this very day. The promise of peace in the 1990s was intoxicating. The United States emerged as the sole superpower, ushering in what many call the unipolar world. Russia, the former heart of the Soviet Empire, struggled with economic collapse, political turmoil, and a wounded pride. Former Soviet republics, from Ukraine to the Baltic states, charted their own course, some leaning west, others clinging to Moscow. NATO expanded eastward, promising security for nations once trapped behind the Iron Curtain. But with every expansion, resentment grew inside Russia, planting seeds of future conflict. Nuclear weapons, the ultimate specter of the Cold War, did not vanish. Thousands of warheads still sat in silos, submarines, and bomber bases. Treaties like START and INF reduced arsenals, but never erased them. Humanity had stepped back from the cliff, yet the cliff remained. Even today, more than 12,000 nuclear weapons exist worldwide, a reminder that the danger of annihilation has not disappeared, only receded into the background. The Cold War's shadow also lingers in geopolitics. Rivalries simply shifted forms. In the 21st century, a resurgent Russia under Vladimir Putin sought to reclaim lost influence. The invasion of Georgia in 2008, the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and the full-scale war in Ukraine in 2022 echo Cold War patterns of confrontation between East and West. NATO, once considered obsolete, found itself renewed by these challenges. The same old tension between Russian power and Western alliances continues to dominate global affairs. Meanwhile, another rival has risen. China, once a secondary player during the Cold War, has transformed into a new global superpower. Its rapid economic rise, military expansion, and technological advancements have made it the United States' primary competitor. The new great power competition is no longer just Washington versus Moscow. It is increasingly Washington versus Beijing. From trade wars to cyber warfare, from artificial intelligence to control of the seas, the battlefield of influence has shifted, but the spirit of competition remains unmistakably Cold War-like. Terrorism, cyber warfare, climate change, and pandemics have added new layers to global insecurity, issues the Cold War never fully accounted for. But the central theme of rivalry endures. The US and its allies speak of defending democracy and a rules-based order. Russia and China speak of resisting Western dominance and reclaiming sovereignty. Just as in 1945, humanity once again finds itself divided. Different flags, different slogans, but the same underlying struggle for power and influence. And yet there is hope. The collapse of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union showed that even the most entrenched systems can change. The Cold War proved that leaders, choices, and people's voices matter. Diplomacy prevented nuclear war in 1962. People power tore down the Iron Curtain in 1989. Courage, ideas, and determination reshaped history. Today, the challenge is not only to avoid a second Cold War, but to build a world that escapes the mistakes of the first. Nuclear weapons must not define our future. Rivalries must not consume cooperation. Humanity faces problems that no nation can solve alone. Climate change, global health, technological ethics, and the management of resources in a fragile world. The Cold War has ended, but its shadow lingers. Every missile in a silo, every troop deployed to a border, every speech about rivalry reminds us of the past we narrowly survived. But history does not have to repeat itself. The Cold War is a warning written in the ashes of the 20th century, that unchecked competition, fear, and pride can bring humanity to the edge of destruction. The question now is simple. Will we learn from that warning, or will we ignore it? The Cold War may have ended in 1991, but the struggle for peace, security, and survival continues, today and for generations to come.